Imagine a man who stood in front of the entire world and said, "I am the greatest," before he had won anything that proved it. Imagine that same man, years later, refusing to fight in a war, not because he was afraid of the ring, but because he refused to be afraid of his own conscience. He would lose his title, his money, and nearly his freedom for that choice. And yet, decades later, it would be that same refusal, not his fists, that the world would remember as his greatest victory. How does a boy from a segregated town in Kentucky become the most recognized human being on the planet? This is not just the story of a boxer. This is the story of a man who turned his own body into a battlefield for justice and his own voice into a weapon louder than any punch he ever threw. He was born Cassius Marcellus Clay, Jr. in Louisville, Kentucky in 1942, into a world that told him exactly where he belonged, and it was never at the top. His father painted signs and murals for a living, a frustrated artist who dreamed bigger than the walls he was allowed to paint on. His mother cleaned houses to help make ends meet. The Louisville young Cassius grew up in was a city split cleanly down a color line, where black families were kept out of restaurants, pools, and neighborhoods simply because of the color of their skin. He felt that injustice long before he had the language to describe it. It shaped something quiet and burning inside him, long before the world ever saw him throw a punch. The story of how he found boxing is almost too poetic to be true. At 12 years old, his bicycle was stolen. Furious, he told a police officer he wanted to find the thief and beat him up. The officer, who happened to train young boxers at a local gym, told him he'd better learn how to fight first. That chance encounter lit a fuse. Within weeks, the skinny, motor-mouthed kid was in the gym every day, shadowboxing in mirrors, running through the streets before sunrise, telling anyone who would listen that he was going to be the heavyweight champion of the world. Nobody believed him. He kept saying it anyway. But greatness is never handed over easily, and his early years were filled with doors slammed shut. Even after winning Olympic gold in Rome in 1960, he came home to a country that still refused to serve him a meal in some of its own restaurants. Legend says he was so disgusted by the hypocrisy of celebrating him as a hero while denying him basic dignity that he threw his gold medal into a river. Historians still debate the exact truth of that story, but the emotion behind it was undeniably real. He had proven himself to the world, and his own country still would not fully claim him as one of its own. As his career grew, so did his willingness to challenge the world's expectations of who he was supposed to be. He converted to Islam and changed his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, rejecting what he called a name given to his family by slaveholders. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Sports writers refused to use his new name. Fans who had once cheered him turned on him overnight. He was mocked, threatened, and painted as dangerous and un-American. He stood in the eye of that storm and refused to bend. He had learned long before most men his age that being loved and being true to yourself are not always the same thing, and he chose truth. Then came the moment that would define him far beyond the boxing ring. In 1967, at the peak of his career, Ali refused to be drafted into the Vietnam War, declaring himself a conscientious objector on religious grounds. His now famous words that he had no quarrel with the people of Vietnam and that no one there had ever called him a slur or treated him as less than human the way his own country had, sent shockwaves through America. Within hours, boxing commissions stripped him of his heavyweight title. His passport was revoked. He was arrested, convicted, and banned from the sport that had made him a legend, all before he had thrown a single punch in his own defense in court. For 3.5 years, what should have been the absolute prime of his athletic career, Muhammad Ali did not box,
He faced the very real possibility of prison. He was broke, boycotted, and abandoned by much of the public. And yet, instead of disappearing, he transformed into something new, a public speaker, a symbol, a man who traveled to college campuses across the country and spoke about pride, justice, and resistance to young people hungry for a voice like his. He turned exile into education. When the Supreme Court finally overturned his conviction in 1971, he did not return to boxing bitter. He returned determined to reclaim what had been stolen from him. What followed was one of the most remarkable comebacks in the history of sport. In 1974, against the fearsome, seemingly unbeatable George Foreman, Ali stepped into the ring in Kinshasa, Zaire, for a fight the world called the Rumble in the Jungle. He was older, slower, and given almost no chance of winning. Instead, he invented a strategy on the spot that boxing experts still study today. Leaning back against the ropes, absorbing punishing blow after punishing blow, letting Foreman exhaust himself completely before exploding forward in the 8th round to knock him out. It was not just a win, it was proof that intelligence, patience, and heart could defeat raw power. A year later came the Thrilla in Manila, a brutal, punishing battle against his greatest rival, Joe Frazier, fought in suffocating heat that pushed both men to the very edge of human endurance. Ali later said it felt like the closest thing he had ever experienced. He won, but the fight took something from both men that neither would ever fully get back. These fights were not just entertainment. They became global spectacles watched by hundreds of millions, turning Ali into arguably the most famous face on earth, recognized in villages without electricity and in penthouses in Manhattan alike. But greatness always comes at a price, and Ali's price was steep. The very sport that made him immortal was also slowly destroying him from the inside. Fight after fight, punch after punch, his body absorbed damage that would not reveal its full cost until years later. His personal life was equally complicated. Multiple marriages, public infidelities, and a fierce, sometimes cruel rhetorical style in the ring that included racially charged taunts against opponents like Joe Frazier, words Ali himself would later express regret over. He was not a flawless hero. He was a brilliant, contradictory, deeply human man who could inspire millions and wound people close to him in the very same year.
In 1984, just 3 years after his final fight, Muhammad Ali was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, widely believed to be linked to the thousands of blows he had absorbed over a 21-year career. The man once celebrated for his lightning speed and rapid-fire words slowly lost both. His hands began to tremble. His once booming voice grew soft and halting. For a man whose entire identity had been built on movement and sound, this was a cruel irony that he faced for the next 32 years in full view of the public that had once watched him dance. And yet, even in silence, his presence only grew larger. In 1996, a visibly trembling Ali lit the Olympic torch in Atlanta, his arm shaking uncontrollably as the world watched in reverent silence. It remains one of the most powerful moments in Olympic history, not because of strength, but because of vulnerability. He spent his remaining years as a global humanitarian, meeting with world leaders, negotiating the release of hostages, supporting causes for peace, and raising awareness for Parkinson's research. The mouth that once boasted, "I am the greatest," now often said very little at all, and somehow the world listened even more closely. His legacy is impossible to contain within the boundaries of sport. He redefined what an athlete could be, not merely someone who competes,
but someone who stands for something larger than themselves, even when it costs them everything. He proved that principles are only real when they are expensive, when they cost you your title, your money, your popularity, and still you keep them. Generations of athletes who speak out on social and political issues today walk a path Ali cut open decades earlier, often alone, often mocked, long before it was safe or fashionable to do so. When Muhammad Ali died in 2016, world leaders, athletes, and ordinary people from every corner of the globe mourned him not simply as a boxer, but as a symbol of what it means to remain true to yourself under the extreme pressure imaginable. His funeral in Louisville drew people of every faith and background, a final fitting tribute to a man who had spent his life refusing to be confined by the categories others tried to place him in. Black and American, Muslim and beloved, defiant and deeply loving, brutal in the ring and gentle outside it. So why should someone born decades after his final fight still care about Muhammad Ali? Because his life asks each of us a question that never goes out of date. What are you willing to lose in order to keep your integrity? He lost his title, his prime athletic years, and the approval of millions, all to hold on to a belief he considered non-negotiable. He was not perfect. He could be arrogant, unfair, and flawed, but he was relentlessly, unmistakably himself, in an era that demanded he be anyone else. Muhammad Ali did not just become the greatest boxer of his time. He became proof that the fight worth winning is not always the one in front of you, but the one within yourself. Muhammad Ali's life teaches that true greatness is not measured only by titles, records, or victories. It is measured by the willingness to stand by your convictions, even when it costs you everything you have built. Talent brought him fame, but it was his refusal to compromise his conscience, even under the threat of prison and the loss of his career, that turned him from a champion into a legend. His story reminds us that speed and power fade with age, but courage of character does not, and that the most lasting legacy anyone can leave is not what they won, but what they refused to give up.